Hello to everyone. Good morning to our discussion about disinformation. My name is Anja Zimmer. I'm lawyer, author, and advisor on political strategies, and I'm here today to talk with you about what can we do about disinformation. Before we start, some organizational questions. This panel is organized by Better Place Lab. Thank you for that. Better Place Lab has founded an alliance against disinformation. That's why we are here, and Katja will at the end of this panel talk about what this alliance is doing. And if you have any question, I've learned that you could ask these questions after the panel. We are still there and are very willing to discuss with you about any open questions that may occur, but we can't do it right now because then it's a little bit complicated for the live stream. So, why are we here? The main theme of Innocracy this year is that we are in a decade of transformation. And now you could wonder, why do we talk about disinformation? What is the subject here, why we have chosen that issue here? On the one hand side, we live in a time where we get so many information as we have never got before. You can say information is democratized. We can easily access everything we want. On the other hand side, there are actors who can do the same thing and who abuse this opportunity and invoke free speech as a justification. To give you a few facts for the size of the problem, in a study from 2019, 76% of young adults in Germany said they came into contact with false information at least once a week. A third of them think they cannot say if it's right or if it's facts, if it's journalistic content, or if it's disinformation. So we see there's a problem that needs urgent answers. And we would like to discuss today about what are the reasons for this amount of disinformation we found in the internet. What could be possible solutions? What is the role of social media in it? And most of all, how much do we have to tolerate? To do that, I would like to start with an absolute expert in this field. Daniel Moosbrugger, please come to us. Daniel? Daniel is a freelance journalist, trainer, and expert in digital security. He is writing his PhD about the surveillance effect on journalism and has done a lot of work on data protection and internet regulation. And before his time as a freelance journalist, he worked for Reporter Without Borders and Deutsche Welle. So I think you have a lot to tell us. The floor is yours.
Dear technical guys, the iPhone, oh, I only see. Hello, hello, hello?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, now? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, and the opportunity to maybe start our discussion today. And honestly speaking, if we talk about disinformation, giving the opening words for a conference in the year 2021, and the topic is digital disinformation, this is quite challenging because so many things have been said already, so many experts shared valuable ideas about potential solutions, so many studies, you quoted already one, so many studies shed light already on this phenomenon, and of course, so many things have already also been done. New regulations of platforms, removing tremendous amounts of content from the internet, enormous investments in media literacy, etc., etc. However, have we really achieved substantial progress in the topic of digital disinformation? A bit for sure, but to me it feels that we are talking and talking, and we just have the feeling that the dimension of digital disinformation just exceeds our capacities. And to me, in this in this discussion about digital disinformation, the core question is basically, who has the legitimacy to check facts? Who has the legitimacy to check facts? Is it the state, courts, platforms, journalistic fact-checking units, NGOs, the users, the public? So who has the legitimacy to check facts? To answer this question, I'd like to suggest for today to use a way of thinking of Amin Nassei. And I got it especially from his book, Patterns Theory of the Digital Society. Nassei is a German sociologist, and he somehow rephrased the core question about digitalization. Today, digitalization occurs as an interruption of a normal, as disruption, or on the contrary, as chance, as a potential for freedom, etc., etc. We know the debates. And this is how it usually starts when we discuss digital topics. So, for example, what causes the digitalization for our society? Which positive and negative effects does the internet have? Or, like today, how can we counter digital disinformation that has been enabled through the internet? And Nassei, instead, just asks differently. And about digitalization, he asked, for which problem is digitalization the solution? So, the digitalization is a solution. For what? Or more concretely, what are the roots in our society that digital technology has become so successful and is today an inherent part of nearly all components of our digital life? And Nassei's answer, in very, very short, goes back to the late 17th century, early 18th century, when the idea of the national state was born, became more successful, and then predominant. It became, back then, more important to govern larger spaces of land with more people over a longer period of time. And in such a time, with this need, a technology that could easily track human daily behavior, make a copy of the society in the form of data, and this data then be easily processed with calculation machines, just perfectly fit this new need that society had. And with this perspective in mind, to which problem is digitalization the answer? The internet was then not invented by mistake or as a coincidence. No, the internet as a decentralized network just perfectly solves the needs of a global decentralized society we are living in. A global digital society today in which we neither have a dominant state actor that works through disciplinary power, nor a religion that tells us a commonly binding story. Such a society without any top and any center, a decentralized society, obviously needs a decentralized communication infrastructure. And this brings us now back to the topic of digital disinformation and the leading question: who has the legitimacy to check facts? If we adopt now Nassei's thinking to this question, we would have to ask, which societal problem does disinformation solve? Disinformation, as I understand it, we can discuss it on the panel, is the spread of knowingly wrong or misleading information with the intention to influence people into a certain direction. And obviously, disinformation solves the problem that democracy just causes, that we establish a system in which progress is based on facts and conviction. And disinformation allows, instead, to influence the progress into a direction without saying the truth. And that's why I personally think disinformation, by definition, is always a threat to democracy, because democracy just enables it, that disinformation can happen. And the approach of disinformation works in a decentralized society because no one has the legitimacy to check facts anymore. Or more precisely, in a decentralized global society, everybody has the legitimacy to check facts, but not the sole legitimacy anymore. No state, no platform, no whatever. And I think if we like it or not, as long as we have democracies in a digital society, we will always have disinformation. So if we seek to create a society without any kind of disinformation, with a clean internet, we can only fail if this is our goal. In my work as a journalist, I'm today specialized on research on the darknet. And you cannot believe, and I don't believe by myself, which crazy thoughts human beings can have. And how much money, how much time they spend to set up a darknet website that is not that easy to do, that is censorship resistant, just to generate a few dozens of clicks per month, to tell obviously complete stupidity. So, as I see it, one of the most important lessons for us is resilience. We'll have to acknowledge, this does not mean accept, but acknowledge that disinformation is out there and is here to stay. We must combat it, yes, but the goal mustn't be a clean internet, but a resilient democracy with a functioning democratic discourse that works although we have digital disinformation. That's why I personally have my doubts about the effectiveness of removal strategies, like it was done recently with RT and YouTube. Of course, the platform has the right to enforce their own rules, and just because you remove content from the internet that tells false and misleading information, you're not automatically a censor. My doubt, again, stems from the question we have to ask ourselves: why do we want to remove RT? Do we really believe that people who mistrust our democratic institutions, who mistrust media, political leaders, that we bring them back to the democratic arena if we remove content from popular websites, which just means that this particular content is just 3 clicks more away in the internet and still findable? I think in a decentralized society where nobody has the legitimacy to check facts, this fight can never be won. And in my previous work for Reporters Without Borders, we concentrated more on approaches that aim to make the democratic arena more resilient and more attractive for people to join, instead of focusing on the bad guys. For example, in the so-called Journalism Trust Initiative, we set up a multi-stakeholder in a multi-stakeholder way, a standard setting that is machine readable so that platforms can use these standards in order to technically separate between trustworthy and other content. And I'm still convinced that this way, making the democratic arena more attractive, more resilient, is the right way. And we have plenty of things to do there. To build the democratic digital arena, all democratic forces would have more together, instead of battling against each other. Today, the front of disinformation is also so successful because we, in the democratic spectrum, so to say, are focused on each other, wishing that our conviction, our solution for the problem becomes the predominant and the only one. But again, for me, no single law, no global algorithm, no AI, no content moderators could ever deal with digital information in a decentralized society alone. The one-fits-all regulation does not fit into a decentralized global society. So concluding, I think we could make progress in this discussion if we stop discussing the question of disinformation in exclusionary alternatives, such as platforms or regulators, self-regulation or criminal code, deletion or freedom of expression, and especially here in Germany, federal states or federal government. I'd like to see this all more replaced with an end. This could lead to a more complex governance structure that better fits to the decentralized structure of our digital society and accepts that no single actor today has the legitimacy to check facts anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and we got a lot of food for thought for the discussion later. One issue Daniel raised is the question, what happens to the people who are believing in all this disinformation? We are here on a psychological side, and that is why I'm very happy to give the floor. I cannot introduce her here because she is not here because of a dog problem, but I can give a video floor to Pia Lamberti. Pia is a psychologist and expert in the field of conspiracy ideologies. She is a researcher and since March 21, the CEO of CMAS, Center for Monitoring, Analysis and Strategy. Many of you might know her because she has written, together with Katharina Nokun, a very, very fantastic book I would recommend to read, Fake Facts, wie Verschwörungstheorien unser Denken bestimmen. Pia will now tell us a little bit about what happened to the people who read all this disinformation stuff. For that you have to turn around because we will see a video.
For me, it's important that we differentiate between conspiracy theories and disinformation. When we talk about disinformation, we mean that somebody promotes something that's wrong, that's clearly wrong, with an intention behind it. Not just because a person didn't know it better, but this person wants to make money, wants to influence the society in a certain way. And when we talk about conspiracy theories, we talk about the idea that there's a group, a powerful group that has a hidden agenda and tries to destroy society. These things can come together, but in general they are not the same. And this is also important when we talk about interventions, because the reasons why people believe in disinformation and the reason why people believe in conspiracy theories are different. When you want to know why people believe in disinformation, it is, for example, because people don't have the time or the capacity to process information properly. This is also the case when you have a strong opinion about a certain topic. You might have seen that also during the election campaigns. If there's a candidate you have strong emotions about, then you are more likely to believe also wrong claims about the person. For me, it's important that we differentiate between conspiracy theories and disinformation. When we talk about disinformation, we mean that somebody promotes something that's wrong, that's clearly wrong, with an intention behind it. Not just because a person didn't know it better, but this person wants to make money, wants to influence the society in a certain way. And when we talk about conspiracy theories, we talk about the idea that there's a group, a powerful group that has a hidden agenda and tries to destroy society. These things can come together, but in general they are not the same. And this is also important when we talk about interventions, because the reasons why people believe in disinformation and the reason why people believe in conspiracy theories are different. When you want to know why people believe in disinformation, it is, for example, because people don't have the time or the capacity to process information properly. This is also the case when you have a strong opinion about a certain topic. You might have seen that also during the election campaigns. If there's a candidate you have strong emotions about, then you are more likely to believe also wrong claims about the person that are in line with your own attitude towards this person. Disinformation also often works with strong emotion and simple answers, and this is also something that is sometimes appealing to people, especially when they have no time or the topic is not important for them. So when we talk about why people believe in disinformation, it's a lot about own attitudes, own opinions about the world, and time and capacity we have to deal with these kinds of information. Conspiracy theories are different. They offer something to deal with your identity. They help you, or at least they promise to help you in times where you have no control. We see that in our studies that especially when people have no control, they are more likely to see patterns where there are none. They're more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. We also know from studies that especially people with a high need for uniqueness are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. They think they know what's really happening. They want to stick out of the crowd. They don't want to be like the so-called sleeping sheeps, like you say in German, Schlafschafe. And this is an opportunity because you know that people will react strongly when you spread conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories also offer a promise to structure the world, because it's not this complex world anymore that you have to deal with. Every societal problem is reduced to an evil conspirator. And from these three reasons, you see that it's not a lack of knowledge that leads to a stronger conspirational thinking. It is the identity function that's important here. And this is the reason why I think we should also understand the psychology of conspiracy beliefs, because this is the fundament of interventions. When we talk about what we can do now, we have to differentiate between the individual level and a societal level. On an individual level, there are different NGOs now that help you when your father, your aunt, your best friend believe in conspiracy theories and you don't know what to do. They try to understand with you what are the individual reasons why the person believes in it, but it's a hard process and it takes very long to get a person out of this rabbit hole. This is nothing we can do as a society. And so I think on a societal level, it's more important to set boundaries and set norms and draw red lines, because conspiracy ideologists, so I talk about this activists, for example, on Telegram, they try to attack the fundament of our democracy again and again, and they are getting more and more professional. And we know from studies that people who have a strong conspiracy mindset are less likely to be active in democratic processes. They're more likely to vote for right-wing parties, and there's also an openness to violence. We see that already in psychological studies, but we saw that also during the pandemic in different countries. So I'm saying, instead of always opening our arms and try to talk to everyone, we need these red lines. There, especially then when the conspiracy belief becomes hostile, when it becomes anti-Semitic, when it becomes racist, or is against the dignity of people.
So, thank you very much to Pia, although she cannot hear us. Unfortunately, she is not here, so we cannot ask her further questions, but we can discuss with us what we think we should do. Pia said we have to draw red lines. We will come back to that. And we have to look at the role of the platforms. We can come back to that. And this I will do with a great panel. You already know David, who has been there, Daniel, who has been there before. And I would like to introduce to you now Kai Hermsen. Kai is an expert in cybersecurity and in digital responsibility. He worked for the industry, I think for Siemens, and was co-founder of the initiative Charter of Trust, which is a Siemens initiative, if I got it right. And since July, he is co-CEO of Identity Valley. Identity Valley is an NGO that fights for a more responsible digital space and trust in technology. And I would like to introduce Julian Jausch. He is an expert who during a long time already, I think, is concerned with issues about regulation and how could legislation improve accountability and transparency with regard to platforms. He is now working as project director at Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, which is, many of you might know, a non-for-profit independent think tank based in Berlin. Before that, he worked for an NGO in the field of data protection, if I get it right. Yeah, so welcome to all of you. Great to be back. So, Julian, I would like to start with you. What role we heard we need red lights. What role could regulation play in tackling disinformation?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be here. I agree with Pia in that there's individual solutions and societal solutions. And you ask about regulation. I think that's something that I would put in the societal bucket. Meaning it can, in my view, never be the only solution. There's a range of different things that we need to do. But I do think that regulation of platforms, in particular of digital platforms, can play a big role in tackling some of the issues that Daniel discussed, that Pia mentioned. I just don't think the way regulation has been done up to now has been that great. I think there's two misconceptions about it. One is that we can just rely on self-regulations, just let the companies decide on their own what they do and how they do it, and how they report about it, for example. And I don't think this has worked. There's no incentive or very few incentives for platforms to actually do that. Just one example, there is a voluntary self-regulatory instrument at the European level, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is a great step to get the platforms and some policymakers at the table. But the fact of the matter is that there's still disinformation out there, and there's still very little reporting on what the platforms do. So that's the first thing, self-regulation as one of the solutions. And the second thing is, let's focus on the content. Let's focus on individual pieces of content. I think this is also something that has not worked and cannot work. And this is something that I think Daniel also alluded to in his speech. If you look at the individual pieces of content, and if you try to just remove and only focus on the removal of disinformation, of hate speech, of conspiracy myth, it's a game of whack-a-mole. You can't stop it. I think this is pretty much verbatim what Daniel said. So I think regulation can play a role. It just needs to be way more nuanced. It needs to include design choices that platforms make. It needs to include accountability mechanisms that platforms have. It needs to go beyond just content removal, but also how it spreads through algorithmic recommender systems. And all of this, as of now, is in the hands of platforms. And I think opening that up to regulators, to independent oversight, that's the type of regulation I think makes sense. And there's some hints of that in German regulation, for example, in the Network Enforcement Act and in some media regulation. But I think the European Union, hopefully, is one area, one political level where I hope such regulation can actually happen.
And can you tell us a little bit more what you think or what you hope might happen on the EU front, because probably not everybody knows the details of what is discussed now in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a bunch of different things that the European Union is trying to do. I'm just going to pick one that I think is especially important. It's called the Digital Services Act, the DSA. And this is one proposed law that can really, if it's done right, which I hope it will be, that can really lead to more transparency at the platforms regarding how their recommender systems works, regarding their online advertising business model. It might introduce mandatory reporting mechanisms so that regulators, journalists, civil society can have a look at what platforms actually do on disinformation, on discrimination. It might create oversight mechanisms. So I think this is one of the things where it's a more of a holistic approach. It's not just focused on removal of content. It's not just focused on one specific issue area, but it's a more comprehensive approach than what we've had in Germany so far. So hopefully that's what they can do in the next couple of months and years.
There's a study from 2019 where we have asked people, what do you think should be done against fake news? And one answer is 69% of the people said, we want that this content is removed. So, and 58 said we want that bots are identified and are also removed, and 37 said we are not so happy with an anonymous use of accounts. So there seems to be a willingness, at least if you ask people, for more regulation. Mm-hmm. And we have in Germany an approach where the German Landesmedienanstalt, the media authorities, are looking at journalistic standards and say, if you do not follow journalistic standards, then we might think about maybe doing something. Do you think is that a way we should enforce?
Yeah, I think anything that goes beyond just the very binary question of delete or not delete, take down or leave up. I think anything that goes beyond that is already a step in the right direction. So anything where we don't have this false choice that we can only decide that content stays up and goes down, I think this is good. Now, the German media regulation that you mentioned, I think is one step in this direction. I wish it had a bit more of a comprehensive approach, like I said earlier. But the point, again, with the statistics that you quoted is, again, we need to get away from just making people believe it's a question of delete or not delete, because this, again, referring back to what Daniel said, this is a question that for many of the issues that we're discussing, disinformation is very hard to answer, and it will always lead to the question, who gets to decide? Is it the platforms, is it the courts, is it the state? And that's for a question of fact or non-fact, but I would posit that you can even go further. There's the question of, what about opinions? Everyone's entitled to an opinion. Is everyone entitled to that opinion being spread to 10,000 followers, 100,000 followers, 10 million followers? These are very nuanced questions, and it's very hard for one piece of regulation to tackle that. So I think, again, this type of comprehensive, holistic approach is necessary.
Yeah, there's a saying that say you have a right to a wrong opinion, but you have not a right to a wrong fact. So that's maybe, if you consider it under the freedom of opinion approach, then I think there's a difference between opinion and facts. But of course, you're right. It's a difficult question, and it's always difficult to identify when is it an opinion and when is it a fact, and where are the gray areas between. Daniel, I'm coming to you. We heard a lot of you, but you are also one of the authors of an expert opinion for the federal government, in which you spoke about the role of platforms. And we heard it. We discussed it under several aspects right now, but if I ask you the question, do we need different, better platforms? What would be your answer?
My answer would be better to whom? And we had to think about the question, what could be better questions for journalistic content, for journalism media, because especially driven also from a financial crisis. So we have really enormous financial deficiencies in the current media system, and that is not only, but also because the big platforms put so much of the revenue from the advertisement market in their pockets. And the question is, okay, in the media bubble, so to say, it's often like let's build our own Facebook. Let's make a second YouTube where we only put our stuff there. We make it better. My first guess would be, no, you probably won't make it better. Plus, is it really a good way to copying something? Why should user go there? And then you have two possibilities. Either you can try to reform the current system, I don't know, through regulation, and say to Facebook, hey, you have to push journalistic content more to the people, or you build your own infrastructure. And we said that from the journalistic perspective, it would make sense, because something has to happen otherwise, and we see it already here in the local news sector. We have regions in Germany where we don't have any independent media anymore because they don't have enough money. So something has to happen now. I would say, yes, we need an infrastructure in which the journalistic content that is produced is easy to find, where users also know, okay, when I go there, I find all the relevant things, and where all media come together. And the interesting thinking of this is of co-opetition in a way, like cooperation and competition. So they cooperate in a way that they build their own standard, their own platform, whatever, but they are still competitors on the news market. And last point, platform is not always a big thing like Facebook. A platform is also the backbone behind a Mediathek, for example. For example, what ARD and ZDF now did, putting their Mediatheken together, is also a form of platformization, because in the back end, they put something together and are now sharing a common infrastructure.
A platform is also the algorithm behind.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that we must more think to find a technical solution, a kind of value or public value by design algorithm who gives us better information, who follows different ways to show us the results we are looking for on the internet?
Yes and no. Yes, if we know what an algorithm really is, because often we still think in the broadcast model in a way. The algorithm tells you and you and you what you do. And if we really acknowledge that the algorithm is basically in the end just a rule that always reacts on user behavior and then follows a certain rule. So it's never the algorithm alone. Then, yes, in a way that we for sure could build algorithms that put more into consideration that journalistic content could be, or that it could be a good idea that people see at least, to make it very easy, see at least 5 pieces of relevant information from the day, from sources where people say we trust them. I think this is doable, and it's probably nothing that will happen on the existing platforms, I think. So, yeah, either we force them that they have to do it, or we build a system that does this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's we will discuss that later with YouTube. But Kai, you when we spoke before the panel, you told me a lot about how the business model behind the platform might be a reason for the results we find here, for the disinformation we find. And you also told me something about how you could construct such platforms. Do you want to say something to that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an idea on how to construct a such platform. That's not my cup of tea, but I think what's important, and it came through the discussion from both Daniel and Julian, is that looking at the content alone or at the disinformation as such is not enough. For me, actually, it's kind of looking at the symptom of a digital space that is somehow out of order. And that's out of order for a good reason, because it's a good business model. You know, there's a business model behind. So the business model is such that, well, if a certain piece of information or disinformation travels far, that's more interesting to a platform or to that business model than if it doesn't. Right? It doesn't make sense for a platform or for a business model to have information that nobody wants to see. That doesn't work. Right? It doesn't reach anybody. There's no business behind. Ergo, the platform doesn't really support that. And that brings us to the question, or we asked ourselves the question at Identity Valley. So what is it then why is this digital space as such not really responsible if it comes to everything, actually, not just disinformation? But okay, I need to be careful here, because not everything is bad online, right? So we had this before, I think. So there's very good things happening, and then there's also bad things happening, and we need to be careful there. And also careful with regulation, of course, because it can stifle the good things and then maybe not even solve the bad things. That can happen. One thing we did was looking at this and describing it as a very complex challenge, which it is. And then we had this idea of, there's another complex challenge of an externality created by business models, and that's the one of sustainability, or of not being very sustainable. And one answer to that issue has been already some years ago to formulate a set of goals, global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that hopefully most of you here know or have heard about. But it's kind of it's an orientation. It's something you can work against, not just as a government, but as organizations, as NGOs, even as an individual, you can work against that. And we had this idea, or we proposed this idea of doing the same for the digital space. Because in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, there's nothing digital in there. It's very much, oh, let's describe the real world. They're super important, don't get me wrong. They are very, very good in what they do, but they don't describe the digital world and everything that's happening in the digital world, because they were formulated 5 years ago, and they started formulating them 10 years ago. And that iPhone we all have in our pocket, or Android, or you name it, it's only 12 years old or so. So, you know, they couldn't describe what is happening there. So now our idea is to come up with a set of goals that describe responsible behavior in designing business models and then abstracting them into technology and operating that technology. Because you have to go through that cycle, because behind the platform there's not just algorithms, there's actually people taking decisions and programming to a large extent these algorithms. There's people taking decisions to go in this direction or in another direction. And if we were, if we were to find a common ground on what responsible behavior in taking these decisions would look like, I think that would be a good way in the right direction. And might even tackle a little bit of our disinformation issue, but not just that, but also some other things.
But to be a little bit more concrete, you have developed 7 goals.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate maybe on 2 or 3 of them to give us an example how you are thinking, and maybe even find a link to disinformation?
Yeah. So these 7 goals are, let's say, the overarching. They're like in buckets, and the way we've designed them is to think about a data value chain. You know, where does data emerge, and where does it end up? And it's being computed in the meantime. But it's also worked through a system. So it starts with digital literacy, and I think I read media literacy a lot here. I think there's also something like digital literacy. You need to, or everyone needs to have an understanding. How does the digital world work? What are the opportunities? But also what are the challenges? And I do think that most of us fail on that test. Even as experts, it's difficult to kind of navigate your way through the digital world, let alone you're not even an expert, right? You haven't been growing up like this. And this is not a school challenge also, but it's a challenge for society by and large, from preschool to post-retirement. That's goal number 1, because that's the most important one. If we don't have that, don't even think about the rest. Number 2 is cybersecurity. We need to make also platforms cybersecure. And we're somehow, I think you're a cybersecurity expert, it's so important to have these fundamentals right from a technology point of view. Goal number 3, no surprise, everybody has been talking about that, that's privacy. Privacy is super important. And on it goes. And we really think if you have these it's really basic things that need to be in order. The fun part is we've been launching these values or these digital responsibility goals at the European Parliament in Brussels. They hosted this because we introduced to some parliamentarians, and then it found a group of parliamentarians who said, that's a nice idea, because for the first time it brings this complete and holistic picture to what it actually means to be responsible online. It's not just looking into cybersecurity or not just privacy, but it's kind of painting the entire picture, and I think that's what it needs. We need to look at the complexity of the challenge in its totality, which in itself is a challenge. I get it, but that's what we need to do. If you only look at cybersecurity, separate it, and maybe even write a law about it, which happens, and don't think about privacy at the same time, they might even go against each other. So sometimes just one example, from cybersecurity point of view, a cybersecurity, like an incident handler, would like to see logs of all your movements online at all times, because by way of looking into these logs, you can potentially find out what has been going on. From a privacy point of view, that's not wanted. quite the opposite. So they go against each other from time to time, and if we can bring them together or have this holistic view at it, I think that can really move us forward.
Can I just ask one tiny particular question?
Yes.
Could you name an example where we can clearly say that the current platforms we have are failing? Because let me play the Facebook advocate. Of course, Facebook is super secure in a technical way, and I think they are more or less. They give us the chance, at least as a user. They probably, by law, follow privacy laws, etc., etc. So what would you say, what would be the core difference?
Well, at the minimum, I think it's debated if they really follow the privacy laws, even if they follow the GDPR, because it's, I mean, how to even with current law to check that, right? But I do think it goes further than that. So privacy, thinking it really to the very end, also is about controlling your own data. And that, I think, for sure, you can say it doesn't happen, right? Even the personal data on Facebook is not controllable. You don't have control of it to the very end. Of course, and that's the challenge here, of course they would say that they take responsibility, and that's where the accountability piece and the transparency comes in. So just talking about responsibility, of course, isn't enough, because then everyone would say, of course I take responsibility for these matters. But it's more about accountability and about transparency that can be really also enforced, both from a user point of view. So that's, by the way, transparency is goal number 6, because we think it's so important. So goal number 6, transparency from a user point of view and from an expert point of view.
I sometimes have the impression that data protection is the biggest placebo regulation we have, because we think a lot about transparency and informed consent and informed user. And before I use a service, I of course have to agree to 10 pages of data protection, but there are studies that more or less nobody is reading these things. And that we of course all agree, because what else could we do? Not use the internet, which might be an option, but not for most of us. So, Julian, would you say we need maybe even a new data protection law, which changes who owns the data? Or goes it too far now for this panel?
Well, it does veer off a little bit, but I think the consent question that you raised is a valid one, in the sense that we talk about, you know, the power of platforms and the information asymmetry that we have between users and platforms. So the example that you gave about consent is, I think the idea of informed voluntary consent is stretched in some service, I think. I do think the general data protection regulation that you mentioned is a good law. It's good that we have this. It gives users a lot of rights. I think the enforcement is lacking in certain areas. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a placebo law. I think it's a good law on paper. It just needs to be enforced better. So I don't think a complete overhaul is necessary. I do think, going back to the more like the platform power and disinformation angle to it, it does speak to the interconnectedness of various issues. I mean, we started out talking about disinformation. We already talked about cybersecurity now. Now we're talking about data protection. You mentioned consent, which has a lot of to do with economic networks effect, which brings in competition and market power angles. And what I'm trying to say with that is, when you look at disinformation and then you treat it as a symptom, like you said, which I agree with, and then you look at all the issues that are behind it, it's a range of different issues. So there's not just, and then don't forget the psychological factor that Pia mentioned in her speech. So if you think about all these different things, I don't think there's just this one silver bullet, this one magic solution that we can just be like, all right, over. And then also referring back to what Daniel said, should we even attempt to say, okay, now we don't have any more disinformation? Is that even feasible and realistic? So what I'm trying to say is, look at disinformation as a symptom, as like at the tip of the iceberg, and then look at the structural problems, the structural societal challenge underneath it, and tackle those. And there's a number of things, a range of different opportunities that you can do to do that.
And what would you say is the most urgent one? Or could you say that? If we have a number of solutions, when you talk about platform regulation, you end up at a certain point. The conclusion is quite complicated. If we try to find a ranking, what would be the most important thing we should do right now?
Well, two things on that. One, on your statement that it's complicated. I agree, and I've said that here on the panel just now too. Like, it's not an easy problem, but I also don't want us to, or I would not like everyone here to walk away with, oh, it's such a complicated, such a difficult problem that we can't solve it. That's not the case. It's solvable. Like, it's a task that we all have to do together. And I think saying that it's such a complex issue and you need to think about it for 10 years before you can do something, that plays into the hands of those people who spread disinformation and those people who benefit from disinformation, even though it's just indirectly, like the platforms financially. So that's just one thing. Yes, it's complicated, but that shouldn't paralyze us. And then your ranking question, I'm not sure if I could do a ranking of like that's the number one thing. I think just from a personal view, because that's what I'm working on, I do think it's long past time that we hold platforms accountable, that we increase transparency, that we make sure that users have a better understanding of how these platforms work. So I would kind of rank that very high, but that's just because I tend to work on it a lot. That doesn't mean to say that all the other things aren't equally important. I think they do need to go hand in hand. It's pieces of a puzzle that need to work together.
Daniel, would you have a favorite that you say, this is a thing we should do the most urgently?
From the journalistic perspective, finding standards that allows media to sustain, because that's really, really urgent. I really have to say that. Because the problem at the moment here in Germany is, and Germany is still a paradise for independent journalism if we have a global perspective, is that that no actor of the regulators who could maybe do something is really willing, because state support of media is always a bit critical, and on the other side, the platforms are just rushing away. And I mean, I don't have the current numbers, but if I have these yearly reports, how much advertisement revenue just Google and Facebook get globally from the online advertising market, this is so crazy. And this is just money that the media industry doesn't have. So that would be, for me, as from a journalistic perspective, the most pressing one here in Germany, but also in other countries. In other countries, media are even more dependent from platforms. Here, we still have media that have subscription models, etc., etc. In other countries where we don't even have a democratic system, Facebook is still a tool to publish. Without that, media just wouldn't exist. This is good on the one side, but that's an entire dependency on the decisions of a platform that has a business model. And I'm not one of these who say Facebook and Google and all these, they have to be more democratic and more values from their own. Again, for me, it's totally fine if they are business companies. They have to make money. That's their whole purpose, and that's good in a way. So we have to bring them. I just don't believe that it will work. That we expect from them, from their own purpose, if they want to make money, that they will do everything that would be good for a democratic system. Yeah.
Can I just one thing, because you said, then we can back that, but you said it's a question of money for journalistic content. So this is one of the most, it's at least as complicated as disinformation. But how do you think we could do that? In the report, of the federal government. They talked about maybe more taxes for online advertising. I know that and I was one of them. We talked about more state funding for media because we do not believe that, especially if you talk about local media, you can gain that much money. What you need to do good journalism, or we could talk about more state funding for fact-checking, or what would be a way how we could improve the journalistic view.
I think two things. One, also as a journalist who's practicing, I don't want to be paid from the government. This would be the end, and this also, even if I would be still completely independent, people just wouldn't believe me anymore. Everything I would say is then I'm the guy from the government-funded media. So I think this wouldn't work. What I could imagine is that there is something like a technology fund or something like that, where media can, for example, bet with good ideas to get some funding for projects, because you know it better than I do probably, that's just super expensive to build up systems, to build up mechanisms. This would be the one thing, and the second thing would be the solutions that we have already. In my introduction, I talked about the Journalism Trust Initiative. So this is from Reporters Without Borders, this is already a set of standards, of technical standards that could be adopted by platforms. And the thinking is whitelisting, so not blacklisting, but whitelisting. So giving journalistic websites, if they fulfill certain criteria, they get a pixel on their website. Very easy thinking now. They get a pixel on their website, and the algorithm of platforms could see, okay, they have this pixel, so I kind of upgraded it. Again, this would be a value decision by the people who write the platform. So to say, okay, yeah, we would like to have this pixel acknowledged. But again, and this is the second, basically the argument of the second point, this won't happen by on its own. So someone has to push. Yeah.
So this is so you would say someone has to push. We would need a regulation if you talk about platforms, where we not only say we want to have more transparency and we want a non-discriminatory environment, but we might also think about additional matters such as whitelisting.
Yeah, I don't really like this term of non-discriminatory from the recent regulation, because if you whitelist, you of course discriminate. Of course you discriminate. You just frame it differently, but of course you discriminate. So let's be honest, and let's say, okay, if we would like our democratic system to be sustainable, if we do the normative decision, we want a system in which media content is prioritized against user-generated content. Let's be honest, and let's say we discriminate it positively. But this is a political decision. Yeah.
Okay. Kai, you are looking as you want to say something to that.
A lot
I have
of
a question
things.
for you.
A lot of things, but let me focus. So I do think that now we went on regulation, and regulation, of course, is a certain force, right? It's forced. It's a forced, do this or do that. There's also some other levers that we could use, and again, let me go to the case of sustainability, where something interesting happened over the last weeks here in Germany, where there's a group of companies actually asking the new government to be more strict on sustainability regulation, because they feel there's a certain incentive to be more, well, you can debate if they, they're doing this because they see a business model behind it, but there's a certain incentive for them to be more sustainable, because the public demands it. An informed public is apparently a little bit ahead of the policymakers. I'm simplifying here, right? But that's what's happening. And then there's a lot of companies that found it can be a very good business model to be super sustainable and offer that even as a as one of the selling arguments, right? And I hope to see at some point in time that with this, you know, the example of the pixel or the whitelisting, that there are also platforms or media or also platforms like Signal is one example that made a difference by being actually more responsible. That said, okay, if you write your messages here on Signal, they're by default end-to-end encrypted, and what happened? WhatsApp adopted the same protocol at some point in time because they had to follow this, not because somebody forced them, but because there was an incentive to do so. So we also need to think about the market forces and how we can leverage them. Now, the one thing you need for that is for a public and for consumers and a wider public to know what is good behavior and what's not so good behavior. So you need, now I'm back to digital literacy, but you need a more informed public to make more informed decisions. And I think it would also help us to somehow be better able to measure, because you asked that question, is Facebook really adhering to cybersecurity and privacy? And to be honest, I don't have facts to tell you they are or not. It's anecdotal knowledge. Why are we not able to tell if they are like on a, I don't know, percentage score, like a nutrition label for food? Why are we not able to tell, is Facebook good for me or not? We're not able to tell for any given service online. And I think that's one of the things I would put very high on my priority list to solve. Why isn't that possible? Why can't we be more informed? Why isn't there something like a nutrition label, like this ABCD, and then I say, okay, I don't go for D?
Because we're talking about information, so we also cannot say if the Bild-Zeitung is good or bad for the German public.
No, I'm not on the content level, but more on the platform. The way the platform is set up, is it good or bad?
The platform is nothing without content. No one would be at Facebook if there would be no content.
True, but there is a certain, I would argue, and okay, I don't have facts to prove that, but I would argue that the way the platform is set up correlates also with the content that is being shared there.
Of course, yeah.
So you need to go there. I said earlier also, I don't think you can rate like the content you get on a certain platform is very good for you, you know. That's not a game we can play, because I think we all agree that somehow that doesn't really work. But you need to go one level deeper, and I think there are, and that's what we're trying to do with these responsibility goals, there are certain behaviors we can agree as a society are good, and certain that are not so good from a, you know, the way that things are done point of view in digital terms. And if you have that and that agreement, then you can go back to Facebook and say, can you please either rate yourself, or we'll have you rated by these standards, and this is the result.
But would even we on this panel, would we agree on what is good and not so good? I think it's quite a complicated question, because we talk about opinions, about content, about information, and about, of course, also about algorithms behind, but wouldn't it be a very difficult question for us and for the rest of the society, even more to agree on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think good versus bad even makes sense by and large, because everybody has a different understanding. It's more about, I think the one thing we can do is what is responsible behavior. And there I'm fully convinced, after some years working on matters like cybersecurity, you need to see this from the point of view of the user, the end user. No other way. This responsibility needs to come from the end user.
Okay, so the end user agrees for himself what he thinks.
No, that's the perspective one has to take, so to say. And maybe that's a little bit of a challenge, because it's difficult for businesses to take that perspective. But I think that's the only perspective we can take in the end. From if is something responsible behavior from the user's point of view, yes or no? That's kind of a little bit the question.
We are a little bit, unfortunately, running out of time. You want to say something?
Yeah, I just would like to. I think the question you answered brings us really to the root of the discussion about disinformation. Would we here agree about facts or not? And I think, again, if we ask that question, no, of course not. generally, yes, facts and no facts, and as soon as we dive into some further discussions, there would be also among us disagreements. The thing is just, do we need to discuss what other content, whether it's good or bad, or isn't it valuable to, again, now my journalistic perception, but also other would be possible. Let's just say that we among ourselves agree into a certain group that the standards we follow are like that. So these are our standards, dear public. You decide that this is our offer for you. Take it or not. So, and if this, if we advocate for our own standards and be normative and say this is us, and yes, it's not perfect, but this is our offer to you. I think this is the better way to go, instead of having the aim to be able to decide in every potential case what's right or wrong.
Vivian, would you do?
If I may, I would like to turn. I followed the debate and I had some of the similar questions. It's normative questions, it's questions about values, but I would like to bring it back a little bit to the disinformation stuff and make it maybe a little bit more concrete, because I agree, you can discuss about facts, you can discuss about opinions all the time, but when it comes down to those people who actually are dealing with disinformation, they are at risk, they are hurting from this. If you have disinformation that tells you, drink bleach to cure coronavirus, if you have disinformation that has clearly racist tropes in them, anti-Semitic tropes in them, this is hurting people on an individual level, and you can even go so far as to say it hurts people at a democratic societal level. So whether we agree on the values, the normatives behind it, the fact of the matter is there's this disinformation which has very drastic effects to some people, and this needs to be addressed beyond questions of can we find a common ground on certain types of facts or opinions. So, go ahead, come in.
Yeah. We cannot go that much longer because we are already 5 minutes late.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I think it's a very interesting thing that that we came at this, so time is running with you. We could stay here for another hour, but I fear we can't. So I think it's a very interesting angle that you at the end again pointed out. The thing we talk about here is nothing we have to discuss. It's something where we just say yes, it's wrong. It's bleach does not help against coronavirus. So we are coming back to my thing. You have a right to your opinion, but not to your own facts.
Exactly, so. and that's kind of what I wanted to turn back on, as a question of regulation. Because when you mention regulation, it's always like this, like you said, it's like a forced thing. It's always such a big term. But again, the fact is, you have this disinformation out there. It hurts people, and we're at the whims of giant corporations to decide what to do about that, and there's very little recourse. And I think this is some of the tension that I would like to see addressed by policymakers, by us in civil society, by media, and by users, of course, to discuss this, like how to address this tension, that it can't just be corporate actors deciding how to deal with disinformation.
Okay, I think this was a very good final statement, and I say thank you very much to the three of you. It was a very interesting discussion, at least for me. And I would like now to come to Sabine, and I would like to ask you to just give us some space and yes, an applause.
Hello.
So, hi. We are here, we talked a lot about platforms without having a platform here. Now we have one. I introduce Sabine Frank. She is the head of governmental affairs and public policy at YouTube DACH, and also the deputy head of public policy and government affairs at EMEA. She has a lot of honorary posts at FSM, at ClickSafe, at the European Media Law Institute, and before she worked for YouTube, she worked for the FSM, the Freiwillige Selbstkontrolle Multimedia, Voluntary Self-Control Multimedia. So we have a real expert here. And as very often, she's the only one who is here, although I ask all platforms to come. But very often we discuss with Google and not with Facebook or TikTok, although we would like to do that. So you are a little bit the one who has the role to talk about the position of platforms here. You heard a lot about, or we talked a lot about, what is the role of the platform? Is there something, is there a point Julie would like to comment on? Because it's the one where we thought, no, I have to say something here.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure being with you here. Actually, the discussion was so interesting. I could comment on a lot of points, but if you allow, I think Julian's last comment actually would spark me to comment on, and I think that might be also an interesting further discussion for the rest of the day. So, is it really only on platforms to decide? Who should decide? Do we need regulation? Is self-regulation the right way forward? And I think we need to actually be a bit more precise and say, and we actually also favor regulation. We do favor European-wide regulation. We think it's the right way. It's good for companies to have a clear set of rules. It's not that we just say, well, we just want to live by our own standards. But in general, regulation works for illegal content, and this is what DSA is made for, this is what NetzCG is made for, a lot of other regulations in national circumstances, that is the case there. But what mis- and disinformation, and there's a difference even between mis- and disinformation, usually is not illegal content. It's harmful. It's violative for society. As Dani put it earlier, misinformation is actually, violating democracy. So if we all actually share this, I think we need to act upon it and not just sit and wait and say, well, we just wait for another 50 years until European governments have decided and defined what illegal disinformation is, and only that information will be taken down, and all the rest will leave up. We actually think we have a role to play. There is a responsibility also on our side to decide what we think is illegal, and not just because it's just us. We consult with experts, with medical experts, so Corona is a good example. We consult with medical experts around the globe. We have decided and defined our policies. I've never seen actually evolving our policies so quickly than in the 1.5 years of Corona times. Because we know more now than we did a year ago, and did 2 years ago, it was not even in our own memory, so 1.5 years ago. So there have been a lot of changes, and we consulted with the WHO, with local health authorities. We sent postings and information panels to local health authorities so people can inform themselves. But I think we cannot just wait and see and have videos of sometimes world leaders claiming that Corona either doesn't exist, it's not harmful, you can just take some, obscure medicine and it's gone, and hope that society will just deal with that. So this is basically our position, why we think we need to act now. Doesn't mean, Julian, that we would hope for governments to take a more active position and say, we define for you platforms what we believe. But I mean, we live here, most of us live here in Germany, you're all in Berlin today. We live in a very democratic country, and we're very lucky to be here. Not everywhere around the globe we have the same situation, and I think we should also acknowledge this. And sometimes it might be also good, and sometimes we get criticized that we follow local rules and not our own community guidelines, because people think that sometimes our guidelines are more democratic than some laws in some countries somewhere in the world. So I'm just wanted to also provoke a discussion that it's not that easy, and it's not that we feel that we should be the rule maker and regulator, but in reality, governments are not fast enough for at least situations like we have today, where they decide on what information about corona, for example, would be illegal information. So maybe like a long, short first answer.
But if you're, let's just concentrate on our democratic societies. And I think if we discuss about China, Russia, or Brazil, it gets, Saudi Arabia, it gets much more complicated. But if we stay in our democratic society, what would you, as a platform responsible, say, what would you need, or what would you like to have from the legislator, from the regulator? How would a good regulation be in your view? How would a good regulation be shaped?
I think it should be clear, it should be transparent. Not all regulation is transparent. It should be enforceable. It should be precise enough in definitions. For example, one thing that is good about the network enforcement law, it's very precise about what kind of content we should remove. Does that help? Not always, but it's much better than in other areas where just illegal content should be removed. So what is illegal content? So the more precise regulation is, I think, the better for both sides, both for users because they can better challenge our decisions, and it's better for the platforms. That would be one. I think DSA, Julia mentioned DSA, I think it's a good example of unified regulation. It's a framework regulation, so I think that is good because then the whole system of content moderation would be universal for all of Europe. It's not the case for what kind of content is actually illegal or harmful, so national states would still decide, but everyone living in the European Union would then have the same appeals mechanism, for example. So if you don't agree with our decision, you know exactly what to do. By the way, we do have appeals mechanisms already today without being forced, but just as a side note. That would be, so it's a very, DSA is a very complex, huge set of regulatory rules, but I think in general it goes in the right direction. But there are also areas where I think we need to look at the specifics to actually see if that regulation concept will work in the future. For do you want me to go into specifics? Or?
Yeah, what I think is quite interesting is when we talk about deplatforming, about debunking, about what we can do, time is always of essence. So I was quite surprised that the Federal Court lately ruled that you have to give the person whose content you're taking down from the platform time, a warning, and time to explain to you why it's okay, or maybe I got it wrong, but how do you think, how could we get in a democratic state, on the one hand side, fast decisions, because content which is an illegal or a harmful content which is in the internet for 10 days and then is removed, that doesn't help, but on the otherwise we have, of course, we have structures we have to follow. So how do you react to these?
Yes, so that was not, the decision was not affecting us directly, but Facebook. It wasn't not about illegal content, but harmful content. It was harmful, harsh, but only harmful hate speech. So the court ruling has a few aspects which I think is interesting. For one, they clearly stated Facebook was entitled to take down the content just from their own community guidelines. So because there was a debate in Germany and other European countries as well, should platforms only be allowed to remove only illegal content, not harmful content? So our Supreme Court said, yes, platforms have also their own rights, the rights to operate, and they can define their house rules. So we can take down content. That is interesting also in the light of DSA. And the other thing is they said because it was not illegal but harmful content, and I think if I'm not mistaken the account was taken down, they have to give a second warning, like a warning is wrong. They have to write to the content owner and channel owner, it's not YouTube, it's not channel. So the account holder and ask them for a second opinion, and they can go back and say, well, we believe you, Facebook, took the wrong decision because ABC. So that was actually a decision. I think about illegal content there, probably speed is important, but not. Germany has this 24-hour rule, as you're probably aware. I'm not a big fan because I think some content needs to get down much faster. If you think about child abuse material, you don't want to wait 24 hours before you take it down. In some contexts, like illegal speech is very complicated, and you will take longer, consult experts. So I think it makes more sense to have a more flexible system for platforms. So sometimes we are much faster. Sometimes it's important to take time to have a proper decision. So that is my comment.
So I'm following what YouTube is doing with disinformation already for a few years, and I got the impression that...
Yeah, we had a few talks before.
We had a few talks before, so I got the impression you did a lot in the last 2 years. There was even a study saying that. Would you like to share with us what did you do as a platform on the side of the algorithm, on the side of how a platform decides to be better with disinformation?
Yeah, thank you for the open question. So this is my advertisement, 5 minutes.
No, but
so
no.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put it into like the Lächerlichkeit. So no, we take it very seriously, as you hear from a lot of people working for platforms, but we have developed a framework which we call 4Rs. So we remove content, and I agree, only removal is not the answer. So it's important, illegal content should be removed, content that is violative should be removed, full stop. And there's also studies actually saying, Ingrid Broderick, most of you will probably know her. She just shared actually that if content gets removed on YouTube this time, it will not get as much attention through other networks as well. So I think there is an effect also if we remove content. The second such as important aspect is race. So back to Daniel's question, so shouldn't we actually point people to good qualitative content? And this is what the study you not authored, but you initiated, actually also said that if people look at YouTube for, I don't know, it was election content, COVID content, and some other content, if you look for this, you get very often high quality public broadcasting content presented to you in our news shelf. So in most of the cases we present that to people, which we think it's important. The other part where we give information are info panels, so fact-checking panels. We work with fact-checkers, but also info panels on COVID where we send people to the Bundeszentrale für gesundheitliche Aufklärung and other equivalent institutions outside the world. The third one is reduce. So borderline content, which is a lot of times really low quality content but could be harmful, we will not recommend. And this is where algorithms come into play. So whereas in early times, like the click on content was the main signal, so that more often content was clicked, the more was recommended. Over time, we realized that is not a qualitative signal. Click is not a qualitative signal, so we changed the algorithms. It's very complicated. So in Google search, you always say there are 200 signals. With YouTube, I can tell you there are even more signals which come into recommendations. So, but all in all, we want to reduce and not recommend content which is of low quality. And this is very important also in the context of misinformation. So in over 70% of the cases, we don't recommend the content, so which has a significant lowerance in the view rate of such content. There is even a matrix. A lot of you are researchers, and you love that platforms are transparent about the what we give out. So I would invite you to look at the VVR rate, violative view rate. Just Bing VVR at YouTube, you will see that I think only 0.6% of the content that was recommended, we actually had to take down afterwards. So you see very little content that was harmful was recommended. So, and then I would only just debunk that we earn money out of that bad content. And I think it's very logical. So we live for a long-term investment. So we are not here only for the short term, but for the long term. If you would be, I don't know, just say some household brands, Mercedes-Benz, Siemens, whatever, all the big household brands, would you want to have your advertisement being displayed next to a conspiracy theory video? No, you wouldn't. You would go to us and say, this is rubbish, take that down, be better, grow up, what have you. So I think you have all seen that happening a couple of months and years ago with a lot of platforms, and I think we have grown up, and there are good statistics actually showing this as well. So there's no intention of the platforms to make money out of that. So end of my advertisement.
We are also running out of time, but just one last thing. I think it's, I'm quite happy that it's not only an altruistic approach, that you're also looking at an economical side of it. This gives it a longer lasting effect. We talked about YouTube here, but you are here as the only platform representative. Would you say the same is true for the other platforms? Would you like to answer that, or could you answer? Do they, in your view, do they do as much in their algorithm to fight against disinformation, or is that difficult?
I hope you understand that I cannot comment for other platforms. I would say we have all good intentions. So.
Good attention is the opposite of good.
I think this. I think we have younger and more sophisticated platforms. It would not be fair to actually comment.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. We
Thank
are
you.
Unfortunately running out of time, and we have another guest we would like to talk to. It's Katja.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. See you soon.
So, hi.
Hello.
I would like to introduce you to Katja Jäger. Katja is Head of Partner Relations at Better Place Lab. Better Place Lab, for the one who do not know, it is a Berlin-based think tank who is doing research in the potential of digitization to create a more just, future. So, and it's an organization which is built upon self-organizing principles, which I think are quite interesting to see. So, and Katja is here today because Better Place Lab shared an alliance against disinformation, where, and to be transparent, I'm part of that alliance, where we would like to think about new ways to near us to the problem and to get a more overall approach. So, Katja, why did you start the alliance?
So maybe to start it off, we're still building that alliance, so it's not like it's there and we're done. We're kind of still in the process of doing so. Why we started it is that we see that there is a lot of potential out there of civil society actors, different actors trying to engage against disinformation. So there's a lot of people, actors who are sort of fighting it, or as we also today set the narrative more on looking at the actual problems, the roots behind that. But we also see that they're not as connected as they need to be, and that they're not, or I don't want to say that they're not reflected, but there could be more reflection upon the where do I stand in the landscape of disinformation. Because if I know that, and if I know the other mechanisms that are there, I can coordinate better, and in the ultimate goal be more effective, and we think that's not really happening yet, so we're trying to make that happen.
So what are you doing differently than other organizations? Can you say that?
Well, first of all, we are trying to constantly keep in mind the systemic factors that are around it. So we're talking about disinformation, we're also talking about polarization, and the issue of democracy that we have because of disinformation. So we're trying to actually not just look at disinformation as one thing, but as something that's quite complex as the world is getting more complex. So I think also what Pia stated earlier is we have to look at individuals People are somewhat lost in the world, and if there's some conspiracy theory or some fact that they think, oh, that fits to my worldview, they're rather prone to believe that, and even I am, because I am a biased person, we all are. So we're trying to also look at that individual psychological dimension, looking at major societal things that are happening in the world, and trying to find solutions for that. But looking a bit more specifically into disinformation itself, is that we are looking at it as a value chain, and we've been talking about that. We can say, yes, there are the platforms that sort of have this issue with, or we have the issue with the attention economy, but there's a broader landscape around that. And so what we're trying to do is look at this mental, or trying to sort of look at it from a mental landscape, looking at that value chain that's actually starting where people initiate disinformation, be it malicious actors like states or even political parties, where people are producing them, the troll farms that are out there, people who are placing them. We all have heard of Cambridge Analytica. And then it gets into the system of closed platforms, open platforms, where it gets amplified. And we're also looking at that. What are the platform mechanisms? What is the infrastructural questions around that? But also, what narratives strive? Why do they strive? Why do people feel like they want to share specific things? And of course, obviously, looking at the last consequence, people being influenced. And with people, I mean everybody. Because, again, we're talking about what's true, what's not. We all have our own reality, and that is, to some extent, okay. Yes, we have to find a common ground. We have to also set rules. But what we're trying to build is looking at disinformation as the complex problem that it really is.
And what do you think, if you try to be a little bit more concrete, what would you think is needed right now? What are the next steps?
Yeah, so, I mean, what we definitely see is that we need coordinated action. So I think looking at that landscape is only one step, but then also evaluating what are the approaches that we have, and we have a lot of approaches out there. We have fact-checking, we have psychological help centers, we have research and analysis, but what actually helps with the greater problem? So re-evaluating those things, and I think we should not do that in our silos. So we need to come together, and that's what we're trying to do with building that alliance and having that alliance growing, coming together, discussing those topics from a meta level as well as from a very precise level, and hopefully getting a better, more effective response to the issue.
Okay, and how can people, if they are now think, oh, that was an interesting approach, how can they participate?
Of course, they can reach out to us. So if you are involved in that kind of issue, we are currently actually conducting stakeholder interviews. So speaking to people who are sort of acting within this system, and I think in some way we all are, but specifically more acting against disinformation, reach out to us, get into the conversation with us, maybe even join the alliance, and only to say that alliance cannot stand if there's no funding for the long run. So that's also, we're looking for people who are willing to dive into this topic with us from a more holistic approach, and we've heard that before. And so we're hoping that people will reach out to us to make this alliance strive even in the future.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this panel. Thank you very much that you allowed us to be here today. And thank you very much to you all, to all the people on the panel, and to all of you that you had the patience to follow this sometimes not easy discussion, but this very important discussion. And I think we have to find good solutions against disinformation. Otherwise, we will have a problem in our democracy. Thank you.
Thanks.